Have you ever revisited those educational 1970s cartoons and realized how wildly inappropriate they actually were? As a kid, you thought they were harmless lessons, but now the colors feel louder, the jokes sharper, and the hidden adult themes make you wonder how any of this ever passed for children's programming. You probably remember Schoolhouse Rock, the bright colors, the catchy rhythms that felt like they crawled under your skin and stayed there for life. But when you revisit it now, you notice things you missed. The animation was jittery, almost frantic. The characters moved with a kind of nervous energy, like everything was vibrating. And then there were the moments adults never questioned, but that now feels strange, like the wide-eyed woman seductively swaying while teaching pronouns in Interjections, or the oddly sultry delivery in Figure 8. These shorts were meant to teach reading and civics, but some segments had an undertone that felt theatrical, in a way children weren't equipped to interpret. At the time, it was just part of the show's charm. But now you catch yourself pausing the screen and thinking, why did this scene feel like it belonged in a nightclub instead of a classroom? Do you remember which song stuck with you the most? Then there was Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, a show that swung between sweet moral lessons and surprisingly heavy, uncomfortable themes. You thought it was about goofy fun in the junkyard, but the stories dug into addiction, bullying, violence, and things you probably didn't fully grasp. Some episodes leaned into gritty realism in a way that felt overwhelming for the age group watching. The sensory part you probably forgot was how quiet your living room became during certain scenes. The sound of the TV humming, the tension in the characters' voices, the uneasy feeling that something serious was happening on screen. Kids weren't used to that level of social commentary, and looking back now, the choice to present these stories through exaggerated caricatures and broad comedy sometimes makes the show feel tonally confused. Did you ever catch yourself feeling uneasy without knowing why? You might also remember The New Adventures of Gilligan, a show meant to teach basic morals through tropical misadventures. On paper, it sounded simple, stranded characters learning lessons. In reality, the show often crossed into weirdly condescending territory. The lesson of the week endings were pushed so hard that they started feeling unnatural. Sensory-wise, you can probably still hear Gilligan's voice, high, nervous, stuttering through moral conclusions like he was talking to toddlers instead of children who already understood right from wrong. And some episodes carried undertones that feel questionable now, including exaggerated portrayals of indigenous cultures that were presented as educational but read today as insensitive caricatures. When you look back, do you remember how the island setting sometimes felt more unsettling than funny? And then there was The Roman Holidays, a Hanna-Barbera take on ancient Rome delivered like a sitcom. You watched it thinking you were learning about history, but the show had almost nothing to do with actual Roman culture. Instead, it blended slapstick humor with odd references that felt stranger the older you got. The sensory flavor of this show was its pastel color palette mixed with the clanking of faux Roman machines that looked suspiciously like modern technology. But its attempt to teach through parody made the lessons confusing. Some scenes included outfits, jokes, or set pieces that felt surprisingly suggestive for something intended to be family-friendly. Do you remember thinking the whole show felt like the Flintstones wearing a toga? And who could forget C-Lab 2020? As a kid, you didn't question anything. You just watched the clean, futuristic labs and believed this was what science looked like. But when you revisit it, the tone feels almost clinical. Sterile hallways, echoing footsteps, and a sense of dread underlining episodes about environmental disasters, deadly sea creatures, and trapped scientists. The show tried to be educational about marine biology, but it often veered into nightmare territory. Some scenes showed characters in life or death situations with a seriousness that felt too intense for children. It's the kind of thing that gives you that distinct memory of watching something that felt grown up without knowing why. Do you remember that sinking feeling you got when the ocean turned dark on screen? Even Captain Caveman and the Teen Angels, which was framed as a mystery-solving adventure for kids, had undertones you probably didn't see. The premise was meant to be educational and problem-solving, but the show's depiction of the Teen Angels leaned heavily into suggestive characterization. Long legs, fluttering eyelashes, flirty posture. The show visually framed them like adult models, despite them being cartoon teenagers. As an adult, you watch it now and wonder why the animators chose to stylize the characters that way for a children's program. And the sensory memory hits hard. The loud shrieking of Captain Caveman, the dramatic zoom-ins, the swishy sound effects used every time one of the girls struck a pose. Did any of those moments feel strangely mature even though you didn't have the words for it? The 1970s were full of cartoons like these, animated worlds wrapped in moral messaging but layered with material that simply doesn't read the same today. You watched innocently, absorbing everything, but now, with adult awareness, you can see how oddly mismatched the intentions and executions really were. You probably remember the strange glow of the all-new Super Friends Hour, a show that pretended to teach cooperation and morals. But if you watch it now, something feels off. The morality lessons were shoved into the script like an afterthought, often delivered through stiff, overly dramatic monologues by characters whose bodies were drawn with exaggerated muscles and strangely idealized proportions. The sensory memory is the dramatic whooshing sound every time a hero struck a pose, the buzz of the Hall of Justice computers, the sudden close-ups that felt too intense for something meant to teach teamwork. And then there were the PSAs where teenage characters talked about peer pressure in voices that sounded like adult actors pretending to be kids. You probably felt confused without knowing why. Did you ever notice how the lessons felt like they belonged in a completely different show? And then there was the Jackson 5 Vachiv cartoon, marketed as a wholesome, music-filled journey teaching kids about creativity and problem-solving. But the animation style often veered into psychedelic territory. Swirling backgrounds, melting shapes, characters dancing through neon hallucinations. As a kid, you thought it was fun, but now the sensory overload feels suspiciously close to 70s adult animation. Characters morphed, stretched, popped in and out of frames, and sometimes performed in scenes with romantic overtones that were far too suggestive for a children's show. You remember the bright blues, hot pinks, and dizzying yellows. You remember the bass-heavy theme song vibrating the room, and now you wonder how a show meant to be educational ended up looking like a music video made for adults at midnight. What scene pops back into your memory first? You also had the Archie show's educational spin-offs, like Archie's Funhouse, which tried mixing comedy, variety segments, and moral lessons. But hidden between the cheerful music and laugh track giggles, there were jokes adults slipped in, references that went over your head but now stand out sharply. Sensory-wise, the clapping audience sound effect felt artificial, repeating the same pattern every few seconds. The dancers' outfits were strangely revealing. The educational parts often focused on social behavior, but delivered it with exaggerated stereotypes, loud personalities, and moments that would never air today. Do you remember noticing that odd tension between wholesome messages and over-the-top cartoon theatrics? And then there was Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space, which tried to teach kids about science and exploration. But the show blended futuristic fantasy with imagery that sometimes bordered on suggestive. The fashion choices, the body proportions, the exaggerated character movements, they created sensory moments that feel strangely mature when you rewatch. Add the smooth, sultry soundtrack layered under scenes that were supposed to be kid-friendly, and suddenly it doesn't feel educational at all. Did you ever catch yourself remembering more about the way the characters looked than the lessons they were supposedly teaching? You might also recall Wait Till Your Father Gets Home, an animated sitcom meant to teach values about family life and responsibility, but the show dealt with controversial topics, politics, gender roles, and social tension in ways that landed awkwardly for young viewers. The sensory details, the soft, shaky line work, the uncomfortable pauses, the laugh track that didn't quite match the tone. Some episodes touched on paranoia, surveillance, and adult relationships in ways that were unsettlingly honest. As a child, all you sensed was a strange tightness in your chest when the characters argued. Now you see it was never intended for children in the first place. Do you remember that heavy feeling during certain episodes? Of course, The Adventures of Gulliver was pitched as a literary learning tool, promising exposure to classic stories, but the execution felt oddly intense. Sensory-wise, the show often cut to scenes where the tiny Lilliputians tied characters down, swarmed around them, or panicked in dramatic chaos. The music was suspenseful, almost horror-like. The lessons were overshadowed by frantic action, stern lectures, and scenes that leaned more toward fear than understanding. As an adult, you watch and think, was this supposed to be a gentle introduction to literature? Do you remember holding your breath during the more frantic scenes? The Pebbles and Bam Bam show tried teaching problem solving and friendship, but wrapped these messages in a world full of teenage drama, flirtation, and moments that looked more like 70s high school movies than children's animation. The sensory piece here is the music, soft rock-inspired tracks with undertones that felt too mature for the target audience. Pebbles' design and clothing were strangely revealing, considering the show aimed at kids, and some plot lines revolved around crushes, jealousy, and romantic tension that felt out of place. Did you remember being drawn in without understanding why? Another one was Harlem Globetrotters, marketed as a way to teach perseverance and skill building. But the show exaggerated the athletes' bodies with near superhuman proportions, creating imagery that felt too adult for kids. Some episodes leaned heavily into caricatures of African American culture, presented through slapstick humor and stereotypes that feel uncomfortable now. Sensory moments, the squeak of sneakers, the booming echo of basketballs bouncing in impossible rhythms, the swirling, shifting backgrounds. You might remember feeling exhilarated and confused at the same time. Can you picture one of the trick shots right now? And then the Brady Kids animated series, meant to teach cooperation and family values. but the show added a bizarre psychedelic bird and magical elements that made the lessons feel incoherent. Sensory details include the bird's strange, echoing voice and the swirling animation used whenever magic happened. Some episodes pushed romantic undertones between young characters in ways modern standards would reject instantly. Looking back, you wonder why the animators inserted suggestive framing or poses during innocent conversations. Do you remember how the magical transitions always felt oddly hypnotic? You probably also remember Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, which marketed itself as an introduction to geography, ecosystems, and adventure ethics. But the show's designs included loincloths, muscular bodies, and jungle women drawn with mature curves and flowing hair. The sensory power of the show came from the echoing jungle calls, the heavy drum beats, and Tarzan's dramatic entrance sequences. Looking back, the action sequences were surprisingly violent, and some scenes depicted characters in distress in ways that were too realistic for kids. The educational label feels laughable now. What moment comes to mind first? And who could forget Speed Buggy, which taught teamwork and responsibility but slipped in suggestive jokes and visual gags that clearly weren't for children. Sensory-wise, the engine revs, the rumbling of tires, and the way the car vibrated during conversations created an odd physical sensation even through the screen. Some character designs leaned too far into flirtatious territory, betraying the show's educational facade. Do you remember feeling like the car had more personality than the humans? Even Star Trek, the animated series, supposedly educational about science and ethics, had moments that skirted weirdly close to adult themes. Alien designs were sometimes strangely sensual. Body movements were exaggerated. Some plots dealt with death, existentialism, and psychological fear. The sensory detail you might still remember is the eerie hum of the ship combined with the flat, haunting animation style. It felt quiet, dark, and mature. Did you ever feel like you were sneaking into grown-up TV even though it aired in the daytime? These shows all carried the same strange charm. Lessons you were meant to learn, wrapped in imagery you weren't meant to interpret. It's only when you revisit them that you realize just how many layers of adult intention were hiding behind bright colors, cheerful jingles, and Saturday morning innocence. You might also remember the new Scooby-Doo movies, which you were told would teach problem-solving and critical thinking. But instead of educational structure, the show leaned into chaotic celebrity crossovers that often felt confusing and strangely adult. Sensory-wise, you probably remember the long, dragging conversations, the awkward pauses, and the scenes where guest stars made suggestive jokes that never should have appeared in a Saturday morning cartoon. Add the exaggerated character designs, especially for the adult women who appeared on the show, and suddenly the educational label feels like a distant joke. Do you remember how the mysteries always felt secondary to whatever bizarre guest star interaction took center stage? You probably watched Devlin too, the wholesome motorcycle stunt family cartoon meant to teach responsibility and courage. But looking back now, the entire show radiates danger. The sensory memory is the sound of engines revving, the roar of crowds, the screeching crashes that felt too realistic. The moral lessons were delivered right after scenes where characters nearly died or were hospitalized, creating a strange emotional whiplash. And some episodes touched on themes of obsession, envy, and family conflict with a seriousness that felt more like adult drama than children's education. Do you remember holding your breath during those close calls? Then there was Jana of the Jungle, marketed as a nature education show, but its visuals were anything but educational. Jana was drawn with proportions and clothing designed for adult male viewers, not children. The lush jungle backgrounds, the dripping water, the shimmering sunlight, all created a reflective, sensual atmosphere that contradicted the informational narration. And then there were the lessons on wildlife that often veered into overly dramatic danger scenarios, making the jungle feel like a place of constant threat. Do you remember being more mesmerized by Jana's dramatic leaps than by the so-called nature facts? Another was The Mighty Heroes, originally intended to teach teamwork and perseverance, but the show's frantic pace, exaggerated physical humor, and bizarre villain designs made it feel more chaotic than educational. The sensory imprint is the squeaky, rubbery sound effects, the stretched-out animations of bodies contorting, and the strange, low rumble of villains who were drawn with unsettling features. The lessons were overshadowed by slapstick that bordered on disturbing. Do you remember wondering why everything moved like it was made of liquid rubber? Even Kong Phooey, billed as a show promoting discipline and problem-solving, had layers you probably didn't notice as a child. The martial arts theme leaned into stereotypes, and some jokes played on cultural caricatures that feel wildly inappropriate today. The sensory detail is the swishing sound of Phooey's exaggerated kicks, the jazzy background music, and the strangely flirtatious interactions between characters. As an adult, you notice the way the camera lingered on certain designs in ways that absolutely weren't meant for children. Do you remember laughing at jokes you didn't actually understand? And then there was Valley of the Dinosaurs, meant to teach survival skills and natural science, but the execution had an unsettling undertone. Tense, chases, dramatic near-death experiences, and moments where characters were trapped, drowning, or attacked. The sensory memory is the distant roar of dinosaurs mixed with heavy jungle ambience that sometimes felt claustrophobic. The educational pieces were quickly buried under scenes of danger that left your younger self gripping the nearest pillow. Do you remember that tightening feeling in your stomach during the chase sequences? Another forgotten one is Fantastic Voyage, the animated remake of the film, sold to parents as a science learning tool. But the show had visuals that felt more sci-fi horror than educational. Characters shrank, traveled through human bodies, and navigated environments that looked like pulsing flesh tunnels. The sensory details were intense, the echoing drip of internal fluids, the low hum of biological chambers, the rapid heartbeat-like rhythms in the soundtrack. For a kid, it felt strangely uncomfortable. Do you remember realizing the inside of a body looked way scarier than your teacher ever explained? Then there's Inch High, Private Eye, supposedly meant to teach problem solving and observation skills. But the show leaned into suggestive visual gags, especially with the character of his secretary, whose exaggerated design completely contradicted the show's educational marketing. Sensory moments include bright neon backgrounds, dramatic music stings, and the rapid zoom-ins on characters' faces that created tension rather than clarity. Looking back, you wonder why the animators mixed mystery solving with adult visual humor. Do you remember noticing scenes that didn't feel quite kid enough? And who could forget The Funky Phantom, which tried to merge history lessons with spooky comedy? But the show featured a ghost who acted more like a drunk uncle at a family reunion than a historical figure. Sensory memories include the hollow, echoing laughter of the Phantom, the dimly lit scenes tinted in purples and blues, and the eerie sound effects used far too often. The educational history component was barely present, and the show's depiction of Revolutionary War figures sometimes dipped into uncomfortable caricature. Did you ever feel creeped out by the Phantom even though he was supposed to be funny? The same goes for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, pitched as a show teaching teamwork and problem solving. But half the episodes included romantic tension, high-speed chases, and characters drawn with overtly adult. Styling. Sensory details include the sugary pop music soundtrack, the shimmering stage lights, and the animator's habit of spotlighting characters in dramatic close-ups that felt theatrical rather than educational. As an adult, you can't miss how much of the show's vibe borrowed from adult pop culture. Do you remember humming the theme song long after the episode ended? And then there was Mumbly, intended to teach kids about crime solving, but it quickly slipped into a tone that felt more like a parody of adult detective dramas. The sensory memory is the raspy mumbling voice that made Mumbly sound like a chain smoker, combined with dark cityscapes, dimly lit alleys, and scenes where criminals behaved like exaggerated versions of real-world crooks. Kids weren't prepared for the noir-like tension. Do you remember feeling oddly serious when this show came on? You might also recall Goober and the Ghost Chasers, which was supposed to teach bravery and logical thinking, but the show leaned heavily into supernatural imagery that bordered on horror. Sensory moments include the booming ghostly sound effects, the green flickering lights, and the way Goober would turn invisible in a way that looked more disturbing than funny. Some episodes even featured ghosts with exaggerated designs that feel too grotesque for children. Do you remember hiding behind the couch during the scariest moments? Even Return to the Planet of the Apes, which aimed to teach political themes and social awareness, spiraled into heavy topics like oppression, authoritarianism, and rebellion. Sensory-wise, the animation style was stiff, the color palette dark, and the apes' faces were drawn with unsettlingly realistic expressions. Scenes often lingered too long on violence or despair. The lessons were lost under mature themes, delivered in a format children weren't ready for. Do you remember feeling like you were watching something meant for adults? All these shows delivered moments that stuck to your memory not because of the education they promised, but because of how unexpectedly mature, intense, or suggestive they were. You watched them with innocent eyes, absorbing every detail without realizing the contradictions that now stand out so sharply. And then there was the Kids Superpower Hour with Shazam, a show that promised moral lessons wrapped in superhero adventure. But when you revisit it now, the tone feels mismatched. The live-action segments were awkward, filled with teenagers who delivered lines with exaggerated enthusiasm, creating a sensory tension you felt even as a kid. The animated portions leaned heavily into dramatic transformations, swirling colors, and close-up shots of characters whose bodies were drawn with tight suits and bold lines that read strangely adult. Some episodes pushed themes of temptation, rebellion, and fear in ways that overshadowed the educational messaging. Do you remember how the lightning transformation always felt louder and more intense than anything else on Saturday mornings? You might also recall Jana of the Jungle's sister show, Godzilla, which was marketed as a lesson in ecosystems and cooperation. But the actual show delivered towering monsters, destruction sequences, and scenes filled with roaring, shaking ground, and people screaming in panic. The sensory power of this cartoon came from the deep rumble of Godzilla's roar, something that vibrated through your chest if your TV speakers were loud enough. Even the humanoid characters were drawn with sharp angles, tight outfits, and stoic expressions that didn't resemble anything made for children, and the lessons about nature often got buried under scenes that looked like disaster films. Do you remember how thrilling and terrifying that roar used to feel? Then there was The New Adventures of Batman. You were told you'd learn about justice, bravery, and moral decision-making, but half the time the show dipped into dark alleys, ambiguous villains, and scenes where characters were bound, trapped, or menaced in ways that felt too mature for young audiences. Sensory-wise, the echoing footsteps, dim lighting, and sudden stinger music created a mood far more intense than any parent expected. Batgirl's design in particular leaned into adult-coded visual language, even though the show was marketed as family-friendly. Do you remember that uneasy mix of comedy and danger? Another one you probably forgot was Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, which insisted it promoted conflict resolution, but the show's visual language was built around barely veiled aggression. Cars growled, revved, faced off like rival gangs, and exchanged insults that felt surprisingly harsh for kids' TV. Sensory elements included the clang of metal, the screech of tires, and the way the camera would zoom into characters' headlights like a set of hostile eyes. The lessons arrived abruptly at the end, almost as if the writers remembered them too late. Do you capi? Remember thinking the villains seemed meaner than necessary? And then there's Captain Planet's predecessor of sorts, The New Adventures of Flash Gordon. It tried teaching environmental awareness and moral courage through space exploration, but the animation was strangely sensual. Characters were designed with muscular torsos, flowing hair, and dramatic poses that felt like they belonged in adult sci-fi novels instead of children's cartoons. Sensory-wise, the humming of spacecraft, the ominous alien soundscapes, and the almost operatic music created a tone that didn't match the educational label. Scenes lingered too long on peril, tension, and characters in tight situations. Do you remember how serious everything suddenly felt? A forgotten entry in this era was The Wombles, a show meant to teach environmental cleanliness, but the strange furry costumes, echoing underground tunnels, and bizarrely slow pacing created an environment that felt more eerie than educational. Sensory details include the muffled footsteps in the burrow, the hushed voices, and the dim lighting that made everything look like a strange fever dream. And although the lessons were simple, the presentation carried an unsettling stillness. Do you remember feeling a weird chill during certain scenes without understanding why? And finally, there was the Osmonds animated series, which was supposed to teach lessons about music, discipline, and family unity. But the show frequently dipped into adult themes, romantic intrigue, performance anxiety, and the pressures of fame. Sensory-wise, you can still remember the glittery stage lights, the gyrating dance moves, and the wardrobes that looked more like Vegas costumes than children's animation. Some scenes used framing and movements that made the characters appear far older and more mature than their target audience. Do you remember how the music felt more like a teenage crush than a childhood cartoon? All these shows came wrapped in the bright optimism of the 1970s, a decade that believed cartoons could educate children if they just threw in a moral at the end and sprinkled some narration over the chaos. You watched with innocent eyes, taking in the colors, the sounds, and the shapes without understanding the deeper layers embedded inside them. You didn't notice the suggestive character designs, the mature themes, the near-horror atmosphere, or the subtle adult humor, but your body did. The uneasy flutter in your stomach, the way your shoulders tensed, or that sensation that something on screen felt too big or too grown for you. That was your mind picking up on all the contradictions beneath the surface. And now, revisiting these shows as an adult is like unlocking a secret room inside your own memory. You finally see the strangeness, the intensity, the inappropriateness hiding within the cartoons that were packaged as wholesome learning tools. You can smell the old living room carpet, hear the click of the TV knobs, feel the glow of the screen on your face, but the innocence is gone. You're looking at the past with new eyes, and everything you missed is suddenly vividly clear. What's fascinating is how these cartoons shaped you anyway. Despite the questionable moments, strange undertones, and adult-focused design choices, they threaded themselves into your childhood. They became part of your internal landscape, your memories, your creative impulses, your sense of humor, your fears. You didn't choose them. They simply arrived every Saturday morning, animated lessons hiding inside neon chaos. And maybe that's why nostalgia feels so powerful. You're not just remembering the cartoons, you're remembering the moments around them, the cereal bowl in your lap, the hum of the TV warming up, the dusty sunlight streaking through the curtains, the feeling of being small in a world that felt huge and strange. These shows didn't always teach what they promised, but they left fingerprints on your imagination that never faded. You know what's strange? The more you think back on these so-called educational cartoons, the more you realize how carefully they wrapped their oddities in bright colors and cheerful music. It's like the 1970s were trying to smuggle the entire adult world into your childhood through animation, hoping you wouldn't notice, trusting that the moral at the end would cover everything up. But your memory didn't forget. It stored every sound, every expression, every uneasy feeling that you didn't have words for yet. Take Laugh Olympics, for example. It was branded as a globe-trotting educational competition where you'd learn about different different regions of the world through fun races, but the show's geography was barely accurate. The characters were drawn with wildly exaggerated features, and some of the cultural representations now feel shockingly inappropriate. Sensory-wise, you probably remember the overly intense announcer voice echoing over scenes, the slapstick violence that contradicted the supposed educational theme, and the cartoon women who were, once again, drawn with adult-coded body language. You didn't understand any of this then, but now you can feel the clash between the show's lessons and its execution. Do you remember how the maps always looked like they belonged in a comic book instead of a classroom? And then there was the Banana Splits reruns, which adults insisted were fun and harmless, but hidden inside the goofy costumes and catchy jingles were surprisingly chaotic segments that felt strange even to a child. Sensory details, the quick, dizzying cuts between live action and animation, the carnival-like music that sometimes edged into unsettling territory, and the strange metallic clanging that accompanied every movement of those oversized characters. Some sketches bordered on surrealism. Bright colors, warped perspectives, sudden yelling, or exaggerated reactions that made everything feel slightly unhinged. Do you remember that odd sense of excitement mixed with discomfort whenever the Splits came running onto the screen? Another memory you might have tucked away is Jabberjaw, a show that promised to teach teamwork and problem-solving under the sea. But the lead character, a giant shark who sounded suspiciously like a comedian meant for adults, brought humor that didn't quite match the educational tone. Sensory moments include the bubbling underwater sound effects, the fast-talking punchlines, and the exaggerated way female characters were drawn with flowing hair and angled poses that didn't reflect life under the sea. Some episodes included nightclubs, glam performances, and plot lines that hinted at romantic entanglements, all while pretending to teach kids about marine life. Do you remember laughing without fully understanding why? And then there's Speed Racer's late 70s reruns, which parents sometimes considered educational because they exposed kids to foreign storytelling styles. But the show's intense close-ups, rapid cuts, dramatic gasps, and emotional tension made it feel more like a soap opera than a learning tool. Sensory-wise, the loud tire screeches, the explosive crashes, the sweat lines drawn on characters' faces, everything pushed your young heart into overdrive. And then there were the character designs, drawn with sharp, angled features and emotional expressions that felt far more mature than the intended audience. Did you ever feel exhausted after an episode, without knowing why? Let's not forget the Pink Panther show, too. Adults told themselves it was harmless, maybe even intellectual because of its silent comedy format, but you probably remember how strangely hypnotic it felt. The soft jazz music slinking through every scene, the slow, deliberate pacing, and the smooth, almost sensual movements of the panther as he strutted across the frame. Some episodes included jokes or situations clearly meant for adults slipped in, say, under the guise of sophisticated humor. Even the visual style, with its minimalist design and bold, deliberate framing, carried an artistic flair that children subconsciously interpreted as grown-up. Do you remember sitting there, quietly absorbed, not laughing as much as just watching? And then there was Scooby-Doo's lesser-known spin-off, Scooby's All-Star Laugh Olympics, which was marketed as a fun way to learn about sportsmanship and confidence. But the show's team-based competitions often descended into chaos, with aggressive physical humor and exaggerated conflict that contradicted the intended message. Sensory details, the blaring horns, the overly dramatic play-by-play commentary, and characters whose physical designs hinted at tropes that belong nowhere near children's programming. Certain female characters were drawn with impossible proportions while trying to model athleticism. Did you ever notice how the show felt more like a parody of competition than a lesson in sports? Another example is the Groovy Ghoulies, which adults claim taught kids about friendship and acceptance. But looking at it now, the entire show feels like a rock and roll Halloween party made for teenagers. Sensory-wise, you probably remember the pounding guitar riffs, the dim saturated color palettes, and the characters moving with a swagger that felt more like a music video than a cartoon. Some of the humor had dark undertones, curves back graveyard jokes, morbid puns, and gothic visuals that feel like they belong in a satirical adult show. Do you remember that mix of spooky fun and something that felt a little too edgy? And even the far-out space nuts tried to sneak in the promise of science education. But what you got was slapstick comedy, chaotic miscommunication, and characters who looked like they wandered off the set of an adult sketch show. Sensory details include the dusty, washed-out colors, the echoing spaceship interiors, and the booming, silly noises that punctuated every physical joke. Looking back, the costumes were tight, the humor uncomfortable, and the pacing frantic. Do you remember thinking space seemed more stressful than exciting? One more example you probably haven't thought about in years is the Croft Super Show, especially segments like Dr. Shrinker or Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. Adults assumed the fantasy elements would spark imagination, but the shows often featured characters tied up, hypnotized, or stalked by villains in ways that feel unsettling today. Sensory memories include the glittering costumes, the theatrical lighting, the dramatic orchestral stings, and the exaggerated makeup that made everything feel like a stage performance meant for adults. The educational veneer barely covered themes of danger and adult-coded heroism. Do you remember feeling your heart pound during the more intense moments? What all these shows reveal is how the 1970s blurred the line between education and entertainment, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally. The people making these cartoons combined Saturday morning innocence with late-night sensibilities, layering subtle adult influences into stories that were supposed to teach kids about honesty, teamwork, or bravery. And because you were young, you absorbed it all without filtering. Your memory stored the colors, the sounds, the hidden intensity, the strange jokes, the vaguely inappropriate character designs, and the unsettling emotional energy that now makes so much sense in hindsight. That's the real beauty of nostalgia, isn't it? You're not just remembering the shows, you're remembering the version of yourself who watched them. The small you who sat close to the screen. The you who didn't question why the cartoon teacher had such dramatic eyelashes, or why the moral lesson arrived right after a scene that felt too mature, or why you felt a strange twist in your stomach during specific episodes. You grew up in an era where animated education was a wild experiment. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it accidentally introduced entire generations to themes they weren't meant to process yet. But somehow, that mixture of innocence and intensity shaped you anyway. It became part of your internal landscape, the quiet archive of childhood moments that surface whenever you see a clip, hear an old theme song, or remember the way morning sunlight hit the TV screen. So now I want to hear from you. When you look back at these cartoons with your adult eyes and child memories intertwined, which one stands out as the most surprising now? Which one felt different when you revisited it? And which one left a mark you didn't fully understand until years later? Share your answer in the comments. And if this journey into the strange, bright, unfiltered world of 1970s educational cartoons unlocked a memory you didn't even realize you still had, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because there are so many more forgotten corners of your past waiting to be explored, and I'm here to help you find every one of them. Coonskin, 1975. The 70s were supposed to be the age of liberation, bell-bottoms, funk music, blaxploitation, women's rights, and second chances. But turn on a TV back then, and the color might have changed. The bias hadn't. You had cartoons that looked progressive, voiced by black actors, dressed in the language of satire. Yet beneath the laugh tracks and neon lights was something darker, something that said more about America's guilt than its growth. And nowhere was that clearer than in a film called Coonskin. You might not have heard of it, but if you had walked past a downtown theater in 1975, you would have seen the protesters before you saw the poster. Pickets lined the block, NAACP members, students, even the occasional priest, holding signs that read, "This isn't satire, it's slander." Inside, the screen flickered with images so wild they bordered on hallucinatory, cartoon rabbits in fedoras, priests with gold-toothed smiles, and Harlem itself drawn like a fever dream.
Say, rabbit, you hip, you big winning, win that plan. Listen to the vice from your ace, boom man, from your race, boom man. This is the man, this is the man.
The director, Ralph Bakshi, said he wanted to expose racism by shoving it in America's face. He took the worst stereotypes from minstrel shows, the blackface grin, the mammy apron, the watermelon gag, and cranked the dial until it screamed. His message supposedly was, look at this ugliness, see what you've created. But for a lot of people sitting in those dark theaters, it didn't feel like a reflection. It felt like humiliation. Three anthropomorphic brothers, Rabbit, Bear, and Fox, voiced by Barry White and Scatman Crothers, hustling their way through Harlem's underworld. Gunfire rattles, church bells ring. The camera cuts between cartoon and live action so fast your eyes can't decide what's real. Then a scene unfolds where gangsters in priest robes shoot up a congregation, while a Louis Armstrong parody croons in the background. You can almost smell the cigarette smoke in that tiny cinema. Hear the nervous laughter. The satire was supposed to condemn exploitation, but the caricatures were so raw they reopened wounds instead. You have to remember the timing. This was just 7 years after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, when race riots still simmered in memory. America was desperate for progress, and here comes a white director reviving minstrel imagery, calling it social commentary. The NAACP called it the most reprehensible portrayal of black life since Birth of a Nation. Even the title, Coonskin, used a slur so old it stung like a fresh insult. And yet Bakshi doubled down. He told interviewers, if you think it's racist, you're missing the point. He claimed he was showing racism's absurdity by exaggerating it, but here's the truth you feel in your gut, more than you reason it out. Intent doesn't soften impact. When a film uses the N-word 24 times, when every black character is drawn with grotesque lips and rolling eyes, the audience doesn't leave enlightened, they leave exhausted. Now, the sensory memory of Coonskin is unlike anything else from its decade. It's sticky, grainy. You can practically feel the sweat of 1970s New York dripping off the screen, the mix of diesel fumes, fried food, and desperation. Bakshi rotoscoped his streets straight from reality, filming real Harlem corners and painting over them in ink. The soundtrack blended gospel with gunfire, blues with bullets. Watching it today feels like flipping through an old photo album that someone spilled whiskey on. Blurry faces, bad intentions, and the faint smell of something burning. But here's where the emotional twist lies. Bakshi wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. America was racist, and pretending otherwise didn't make it better. His sin wasn't the subject. It was the arrogance of thinking he could turn centuries of pain into cartoon irony and come out clean. Think about it. Satire requires trust. The audience has to believe you understand the wound before you poke it. Bakshi didn't earn that trust. He was an outsider aiming for authenticity, but the result felt like theft. He borrowed the language of the oppressed to shock the comfortable, and somewhere in between, both groups turned away. In its own strange way, Coonskin became a mirror no one wanted to look into. It forced America to confront how easily it could disguise racism as art, how you could wrap cruelty in cleverness and still call it commentary. And maybe that's why the movie endures. Not as entertainment, but as evidence, a record of how confused the 70s were about progress, and how fragile satire becomes when empathy is missing. Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't make it through 10 minutes of that film today without wincing. The language, the imagery, even the pacing feels like a dare, but that discomfort is important. It reminds you that culture doesn't evolve in a straight line. It stumbles, it contradicts itself. The same decade that gave us Fat Albert also gave us Coonskin. The same voices that demanded representation also got caricatured in ink. Fritz the Cat, 1972. Have you ever stumbled across a cartoon that makes you pause? Not because it's offensive exactly, but because it feels too adult for its own good. Maybe you remember the colors first, the dusty reds, the grainy film texture, the way everything looked like it was drawn on a cigarette pack. That's Fritz the Cat, the first X-rated animated movie in history, and believe it or not, it was a box office hit. But behind that revolutionary label, the cartoon that wasn't for kids, was something darker, something that used rebellion as an excuse for ridicule.
I ain't no jive. It's black, honey.
Lovely set of eyes there. Four in bed. That's a kick I haven't tried yet.
See, the 1970s wanted to be edgy. Everyone was chasing freedom, sexual, political, creative. People were tired of censorship, tired of pretending. So when Ralph Bakshi adapted Robert Crumb's underground comic about a horny college cat wandering through a crumbling America, it felt like liberation. Here was a cartoon that looked like Looney Tunes but talked like Taxi Driver. Drugs, orgies, riots. It was chaos in ink. You can almost feel the texture of it even now. That faded Technicolor palette, the jazzy bass line rumbling underneath, the smoke curling through the projector beam. You're watching this cat, cool shades, cigarette in paw, talk about philosophy one second and undress a girl the next. It's funny, in a sleazy kind of way, until it isn't. Because then came the crows. Fritz wanders into Harlem and suddenly the satire turns sour. The characters are no longer people, they're punchlines. Blackbirds in zoot suits, talking in what the film calls street jive. Their eyes are too wide, their lips exaggerated. The music shifts to a blues parody, and the air feels heavy. You realize you're not watching social commentary, you're watching a cartoon that thinks it's smarter than its audience. This is where it gets hard to separate shock from cruelty. The movie's defenders say it was a reflection of its time, that Bakshi wanted to mock white liberal guilt by showing how clueless and condescending it looked. But intent doesn't erase imagery. That Harlem sequence, where Fritz infiltrates a black militant meeting and chaos erupts into gunfire, isn't self-awareness. It's exploitation dressed up as art. And yet that's what made Fritz the Cat so dangerous. It blurred the line between rebellion and regression. You could go see it, laugh at the absurdity, and still walk out feeling like you'd watched something profound. The truth? You hadn't. You'd watched a film that used every race, gender, and cause as a prop for its own cynicism. Let's slow down and look closer. The central character, Fritz, is supposed to be the voice of disillusioned youth, a dropout searching for meaning in a corrupt world. But he's not searching. He's running. He dives into every vice, sex, drugs, radical politics, not to change anything, but to feel alive. The irony is, he's exactly like the society he mocks, privileged, reckless, and bored. The cartoon isn't about America's problems. It is America's problem, disguised as a satire of itself. And this is where racism hits hardest, because every black character Fritz meets isn't a person. They're an obstacle or a spectacle. The film doesn't critique racism. It uses it to show how far the filmmakers will go to push boundaries. There's one moment right before the so-called riot scene where the animation pauses on a crowd of black men. Their eyes flicker in the light of a burning car. It's supposed to be edgy, but if you turn off the sound and just watch the faces, you'll notice something hollow. No humanity, no story. story, just a stereotype turned into a prop. And this is the part that stays with you, because while Bakshi claimed he was mocking racial hypocrisy, Robert Crumb, the man who created Fritz, was furious. He said the movie stripped away the soul of his character, leaving only vulgarity. In interviews, he called it a ripoff. He even killed Fritz in his comics afterward, stabbed to death by a jilted lover, as if to say, "I'm done with this version of me." That's the funny thing about satire. It only works when the people it targets have power. Fritz the Cat aimed down. It laughed at the vulnerable and patted itself on the back for being brave. It sold $90 million worth of tickets. You can't call that rebellion. That's capitalism with a cigarette in its mouth. Still, you can't ignore what it meant for animation. For the first time, adults were watching cartoons without kids. They were buying tickets to see sex, profanity, and politics play out in ink. The success of Fritz opened the door for everything that followed, from South Park to BoJack Horseman. But the cost was moral clarity. It taught an entire generation of animators that controversy equals credibility. Let's talk about the sensory moment again, because that's how you remember Fritz. The scratch of the projector reel, the flicker of red light on faces in the theater, the laughter that starts strong but dies halfway through the scene. You hear that jazzy drum solo, the one that tries too hard to sound cool, and you realize it's masking silence, that uncomfortable kind of silence where the joke has gone too far and everyone's pretending it hasn't. By the time the credits roll, Fritz is gone, a burned out symbol of counterculture slouching towards self-destruction, and you, sitting there, feel like you've just watched a dream collapse in slow motion. The movie wanted to capture the chaos of its time, but it ended up reflecting the emptiness underneath. It said, we're all animals anyway, and maybe that's the most cynical message a cartoon could ever send. Heavy Traffic, 1973. If Fritz the Cat was a wild scream, Heavy Traffic was the echo that wouldn't stop ringing. You can almost picture the moment Ralph Bakshi sat down to make it. Angry, defiant, determined to prove that what everyone called racist filth in Fritz was actually art. And what he created next was something rawer, sadder, and somehow even more disturbing. A grimy little masterpiece that tried to turn suffering into poetry. But here's the twist. When you stare too long at pain, it starts to look like performance. Heavy Traffic isn't a story you watch, it's a fever you survive. The movie opens in a New York that doesn't even pretend to be glamorous. Everything looks wet. The streets shine with oil and blood. There's graffiti on every brick, garbage stacked like monuments, and somewhere under it all, a jazz record skips in an endless loop. You don't just see the city, you feel it, like an infection spreading through the screen.
I mean, if I could, I could sleep on the floor and you could,
Listen here, white boy, don't hand me that honky shit. Stay with you. You ain't got nothing going for you. Damn, man. First you help me get my kicked out of a good gig.
And at the center of it all is Joey, a pale, withdrawn cartoonist who spends his days drawing the filth around him and his nights trying to escape it. He's part dreamer, part voyeur, watching a world that keeps eating itself alive. His father's a violent Italian mobster. His mother's a bitter Jewish woman who drinks to forget she married one. And everyone around them speaks in slurs, shouts, and sighs. The movie doesn't give you heroes. It gives you habits, ugly ones, repetitive ones, the kind people use to stay numb. You can practically smell it, the sweat-soaked alleyways, the cigarette ash mixed with rainwater, the sound of a jukebox coughing out soul music in the next room. It's the kind of sensory overload that only the 70s could romanticize. Urban decay turned into art house chic, but beneath that rotoscope shimmer, the racism still festers. One of the central characters is Ida, a black woman who becomes Joey's muse, lover, and ultimately his savior in a world that refuses to see either of them as human. But Bakshi's version of humanity is cruel. He draws Ida with exaggerated hips and a gravelly voice caught between saint and stereotype. She's a mammy and a vixen, sometimes both in the same breath. She's the only person in the film with a moral compass, yet she's constantly degraded by the narrative itself. There's a scene burned into memory. Joey and Ida walking through the city after a bar fight. He's bleeding, she's trying to help. They duck into an alley, and suddenly a group of white men surrounds them, spitting racial slurs. The animation distorts, the colors smear, the outlines break. You can feel your stomach tighten. The moment's ugly, chaotic, too real to be entertainment. And just when it seems like the movie is going to condemn it, it undercuts the tension with a joke. The laughter rings hollow, like someone laughing at a funeral. Bakshi swore Heavy Traffic was autobiographical, that he grew up in those streets surrounded by the noise of a dozen cultures colliding. Italian delis next to black nightclubs, Jewish tailors next to Irish bars. He said racism wasn't the point, it was just the wallpaper of the city. But that's exactly what makes it so haunting. How easily hatred becomes background noise. The film's style only makes it worse. Rotoscoping, the technique of tracing over live action footage, was supposed to bring realism, and it does. The faces twitch, the eyes darted, the smiles fade too slowly, but it also blurs the line between animation and exploitation. You can't hide behind the excuse of it's just a cartoon when the characters look this human. Every slur, every slap, every moment of degradation hits harder because it's half real. When you watch Heavy Traffic, you don't know whether to be impressed or repulsed. That's the emotional trap Bakshi sets. He wants to make you uncomfortable, and he succeeds, but for all the wrong reasons. His version of realism becomes a collage of pain without perspective. Every minority is a caricature. Every insult is gritty authenticity, and by the end, you're left wondering who the movie was really for. And maybe that's what Bakshi was trying to do. Show the decay of a world where everyone is trapped inside their label. The Italian father, the Jewish mother, the black lover, the disillusioned artist. But even if that was his intention, the execution feels cruelly detached. Instead of humanizing them, the film reduces them to roles in a tragic circus. Let's not forget the language. The N-word flies across the screen like punctuation. Ethnic jokes bounce between characters who never stop insulting each other long enough to breathe. It's an auditory assault. Some defenders call it truthful, but truth without empathy is just documentation. And that's what Heavy Traffic becomes. A beautifully animated documentary of despair. Still, for all its ugliness, the film captures something real about the 70s. That fragile moment when America's cities were imploding under poverty, drugs, and racism. There was anger in the air, but also resignation. The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, 1974. You ever noticed how some sequels don't just disappoint you, they betray you? That's what The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat feels like. It's not just a bad movie, it's a confession, the moment where counterculture admits it's out of ideas and starts recycling its own sins. By 1974, the rebellion that once shocked America was starting to look tired. The drugs weren't psychedelic anymore, they were just habits. The sex wasn't liberation, it was distraction. And that's exactly where we find Fritz, a lazy, chain-smoking cat who's burned through every illusion the 60s ever sold him. Except now, Ralph Bakshi is gone. He walked away after the first film, disgusted by how misunderstood his satire had become. In his place, producer Steve Krantz decided to cash in anyway, and without Bakshi's warped sense of purpose, what remained was a shell, a sequel that mistakes vulgarity for meaning. The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat tries to be clever. It jumps through time and space, showing Fritz reincarnated across eras, an Egyptian pharaoh, a Nazi soldier, a junkie, a welfare cheat, even a space cadet drifting through dystopia. Each life is supposed to be a new metaphor, a commentary on race, power, and corruption. But what you actually see feels like a cruel joke that's lost its punchline. The film opens with Fritz lounging on a couch, stoned, his wife yelling at him to get a job. He dreams himself into other worlds, fantasies that always end in humiliation. In one life, he's a pharaoh surrounded by enslaved people, drawn with grotesque caricatures straight out of Jim Crow propaganda. In another, he's a conquistador assaulting native women while bragging about civilizing the savages. You can almost feel your stomach knot as the scenes pile up, each one trying to shock you but only numbing you instead. The animation is flat, the jokes desperate, and the stereotypes endless. Black characters are loud and hypersexual. Latino characters are lazy and conniving. Jewish ones are scheming businessmen. The film doesn't challenge prejudice. It commodifies it, packaging old racist tropes in psychedelic colors and calling it satire. You can sense the creative rot in every frame. Where Bakshi's chaos at least had purpose, where he used discomfort to force confrontation, this sequel just wallows. It's satire without soul. The filmmakers seem to believe that being offensive automatically makes you profound. But here's the truth. Without empathy, offense is just noise. And yet, there's something almost poetic about how 9 Lives collapses under its own cynicism. It mirrors the death of the counterculture itself, that moment when the ideals of the 60s curdled into disillusionment. The youth who once shouted freedom had grown tired. They'd traded marches for hangovers, manifestos for malaise. Fritz, sprawled out on his sofa, became their accidental mascot, too cool to care, too jaded to change. When you watch this film, you can almost smell the stale air of that decade, the mix of cheap weed, sweat, and disappointment. The animation looks bleached out, like someone photocopied Rebellion one too many times. The music tries to swing but stumbles, trapped between jazz and funk with no rhythm left. Even Fritz's voice sounds bored, like he's reading his own obituary. There's one segment, maybe the most telling, where Fritz is living in a futuristic dystopia, dodging black revolutionaries while pretending to be a freedom fighter. It's meant to parody political hypocrisy, but it just comes off as sneering. The film treats racial struggle as background comedy, another prop in Fritz's endless escapades. You can almost hear the script whisper, "Isn't this edgy?" while the audience shifts uncomfortably in their seats. What makes it worse is how unself-aware it all feels. There's no reflection, no remorse, just repetition. The same slurs, the same sexual gags, the same smirking tone, as if the creators thought outrage itself was entertainment. But outrage without insight is empty. It's cultural junk food. You eat it, feel sick, and wonder why you ever thought you were hungry. You're left watching a lazy cartoon that mocks the very people it pretends to critique. And by the end, it's not shocking anymore. It's just sad. The laughter dies in your throat. You start thinking about how easy it is to hide cruelty behind irony, how satire can become a shield for the very thing it claims to destroy. When The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat was released, it tanked. Critics tore it apart. Audiences walked out. It never got the protests of Coonskin or the headlines of Fritz the Cat. It just faded quietly into the bargain bin of cinematic shame. But maybe that's what makes it such an important artifact. It shows you the moment when art loses its conscience, when the desire to provoke outlives the desire to mean anything. Kong Phooey, 1974. You ever have one of those moments when you stumble across an old cartoon from your childhood, and for a second, it feels like pure comfort? The music hits, the colors glow, and you're right back on that living room floor, cereal bowl in hand, eyes wide, waiting for the fun to start. But then, you start listening, and something doesn't sound right anymore. That's what it's like rewatching Kong Phooey. On the surface, it's harmless. Just another Saturday morning gem from Hanna-Barbera. Bright, bouncy, filled with slapstick and silly voices. A lovable mutt named Penry Pooch works as a janitor at the police station by day and transforms into the bumbling superhero Kong Phooey by night. The voice, Scatman Crothers, warm, charismatic, endlessly likable. The theme song, pure 1970s funk, catchy enough to make you dance before you even realize what the lyrics are saying. But look closer, and the nostalgia starts to crack.
Who is this superhero? Sarge? No. Rosemary, the telephone operator? No. Henry, the mild-mannered janitor?
Could be.
You hear that fake oriental riff that plays every time the dog pulls out his kung fu manual. You notice how his accent, exaggerated, broken, cartoonish, turns martial arts into a punchline. The villains have names like the Giggler, the Tickler, or Dr. Tonton Makut, but they all share one thing: they're filtered through a Western idea of exotic danger. It's all caricature. Every chop, every bow, every proverb played for laughs. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't underground satire. This was for kids, at a time when Ralph Bakshi was getting protested for using racist imagery in so-called adult films. Hanna-Barbera was quietly mass-producing casual stereotypes for an audience barely old enough to spell stereotype. And that's what makes Kong Phooey so insidious. It didn't shock or offend, it normalized. Think about the cultural moment it came from. The early 70s had a full-blown kung fu craze sweeping America. Bruce Lee was a global icon. Martial arts movies were packing theaters, and Eastern mysticism was the new aesthetic of cool. Hollywood, of course, wanted in, but instead of celebrating the real artistry or philosophy behind it, studios turned it into parody. Asian characters were played by white actors in yellowface, and accents became jokes. The wise but silly Oriental trope spread like wildfire, and by the time Kong Phooey hit the airwaves in 1974, nobody questioned it. It was just entertainment. You can almost feel that era if you close your eyes. The shag carpet under your knees, the smell of pancakes and coffee drifting from the kitchen, the hum of the TV as the show starts. You don't hear racism, you hear laughter, but the seed is planted quietly, gently. The idea that Asian is funny, that different means silly. Those stereotypes are harmless if they make you smile. It's not malicious, it's something worse. It's invisible. And for decades, that invisibility shaped the way millions of kids saw the world. The show ran for only one season, but reruns played for years. Every time Penry Pooch mispronounced a word or fumbled a karate move, another generation of children learned to laugh at a culture they didn't understand. Even Scatman Crothers, the black voice actor behind Phooey, becomes a symbol of this strange irony. Here was a man breaking barriers, one of the first black voice leads in mainstream animation, playing a character drenched in another culture's stereotype. His performance was joyful, magnetic, full of soul, but the writing around him trapped that talent inside a caricature. It's a paradox, progress wrapped in parody. There's a moment that sums it up perfectly. In one episode, Kong Phooey opens his Hong Kong Book of Kung Fu and confidently declares, "Ah, a very ancient Chinese secret," before accidentally punching himself in the face. The laugh track blares. As a kid, you laugh too, but as an adult, you hear the echo of every laundry detergent commercial, every fake accent, every ching-chong gag that once passed for comedy. You start to realize this wasn't parody, it was permission. Permission to laugh without thinking. That's the danger of nostalgia. It doesn't just make you remember, it makes you forgive. You remember the comfort, the innocence, the way the sunlight hit the TV screen, but you forget the message quietly humming underneath. And when you look back with clearer eyes, you realize the 1970s didn't just make offensive adult cartoons, cartoons. It made racism cozy enough to babysit your kids, because Hong Kong Phooey wasn't an outlier. It was part of a pattern, the funny foreigner trope that ran through everything from Speedy Gonzales to Charlie Chan to Mr. Magoo. Each show told you the same lie, that stereotypes were harmless, that laughter excused everything. But laughter doesn't erase harm, it hides it, and that's what makes this final entry so haunting. Unlike Coonskin or Fritz the Cat, Hong Kong Phooey doesn't yell its racism, it whispers it through a smile. It's a different kind of poison, the kind that seeps in slowly, disguised as charm. So if the adult films of the 1970s forced America to confront its racial hypocrisy, kids' TV quietly taught the next generation how to inherit it. The show's legacy today is complicated. Some fans still adore it for the funk music, the humor, the nostalgia. Others wince, recognizing what they didn't see back then. Even Warner Brothers, which owns the rights, adds disclaimers before reruns now, warning viewers about outdated cultural depictions. But a disclaimer doesn't undo a childhood. It just makes you look at it differently.